10 years ago, Daniel Foster stood in the dining room of a small restaurant and served customers himself because he couldn't afford another employee. Today, his company owned dozens of restaurants across several countries. His name appeared in industry magazines. His business was studied by hospitality professionals. And thousands of employees worked in locations that existed because of a dream he once had. There was only one problem. Most of them had never met him. After years spent expanding the company overseas, Daniel had become something of a legend inside his own organization. People knew his story. Few knew his face. And on a busy Friday night, that was about to matter. Because before the evening was over, a restaurant manager would ask him to leave one of his own restaurants. And a young waitress would remind everyone why he had opened the business in the first place. The airplane touched down shortly after 5 in the afternoon. Daniel Foster watched raindrops slide across the small oval window as passengers began collecting their belongings. It had been a long flight, longer than most, not because of the distance, because it marked the end of something important. For nearly 4 years, Daniel had spent more time overseas than at home. New locations, new teams, new markets, new challenges. The company had grown faster than anyone expected, including him. The expansion had been successful, remarkably successful. But success had a cost, and Daniel was beginning to feel it. As passengers filed toward the exit, he reached beneath the seat and pulled out a worn canvas travel bag. The bag looked as though it had survived a small war. The corners were faded. The fabric carried years of wear. Several repairs were visible along one side. Most people would have replaced it years ago. Daniel never had. He had purchased the bag when opening his second restaurant. Back then he couldn't afford expensive luggage, and by the time he could, the bag had become something else. A reminder. A reminder of construction sites, delayed flights, tiny hotel rooms, and mornings when success still seemed impossible. The bag had traveled through 6 countries and countless airports. Now it accompanied him home. Daniel smiled as he lifted it onto his shoulder. One more trip. The bag, as usual, offered no opinion. An hour later, Daniel's taxi moved through the city. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The driver chatted about traffic and construction projects. Daniel listened politely, but his attention remained elsewhere, outside. Watching familiar streets pass by, it felt strange to be home. For years his life had consisted of airports, meetings, and restaurant openings. Every location had demanded attention. Every expansion had created new responsibilities. The company had become larger than he ever imagined. Yet recently he found himself thinking less about growth and more about beginnings. Especially one beginning. The first restaurant. The original location. The place where everything started. He had not visited it in nearly 3 years. 3 years. The realization surprised even him. For a moment he considered calling ahead, reserving a table, informing the staff. Then he laughed. That would defeat the entire purpose. Tonight he didn't want speeches. He didn't want recognition. He didn't want executives. He simply wanted dinner. A quiet meal in the restaurant where his dream had started. Nothing more. The taxi stopped beside a traffic light. Across the street, a family hurried through the rain toward one of his restaurants. Parents, 2 children, excited smiles. Daniel watched them disappear through the entrance. The sight made him unexpectedly happy. That family didn't know him, would never know him, and yet they were the reason his company existed. Not shareholders, not executives, guests, always guests. That had been true 10 years ago, and it remained true now. At least, Daniel hoped it did. 40 minutes later, the taxi pulled to the curb. Daniel stepped out into the cool evening air. Rain drifted softly through the city lights. He adjusted the strap of the worn travel bag, then looked up. There it was, his first restaurant. Larger now, renovated, more polished, but unmistakably the same place. For several moments he simply stood there, watching guests enter, listening to laughter through the doors, remembering. The evening rush was already underway. Inside, tables appeared full. Staff moved quickly between guests. The restaurant looked alive, successful, exactly what he had always hoped it would become. Daniel smiled, then picked up his travel bag, crossed the sidewalk, and walked toward the entrance. Inside, a young waitress named Sophie Martinez was about to notice something that nobody else did, and a manager named Olivia Parker was about to make a decision she would remember for the rest of her career. The moment Daniel stepped inside, he was greeted by a familiar combination of sounds and smells. Conversation, laughter, clinking glasses, the distant rhythm of a busy kitchen. For a brief moment he simply stood there, listening and breathing. It had been years since he had spent an evening in this dining room, years since he had watched guests arrive for birthdays, anniversaries, first dates, and family dinners. The atmosphere felt different now, more polished, more sophisticated, yet somehow the same, and that made him smile. The restaurant was busy. Every table appeared reserved or occupied. Servers moved quickly between guests. The host stand was surrounded by arriving customers. A line had already begun forming near the entrance. Friday nights had always been popular. Apparently some things never changed. Daniel adjusted the strap of his worn travel bag and stepped toward the host's stand. The young hostess offered an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry, sir. We are completely booked tonight." Daniel nodded. "I figured." The hostess looked genuinely disappointed. "We may have a table available later." Daniel smiled. "No rush." The hostess seemed relieved by the response. Some guests would have argued. Some would have complained. Daniel simply stepped aside. Old habits. Running restaurants had taught him patience. Across the dining room, Sophie Martinez noticed him immediately. Not because she recognized him. She didn't. She had never met Daniel Foster. But she noticed something else. The man looked tired. Not angry. Not frustrated. Just tired. As though he had traveled a long way. Which, of course, he had. Sophie approached. "Good evening." Daniel smiled. "Good evening. I'm Sophie. Pleased to meet you." She glanced toward the crowded dining room, then back at Daniel. "Long day?" Daniel laughed softly. "You could say that." The worn travel bag rested beside him. The answer suddenly seemed obvious. Sophie looked around. Every table was occupied. Every reservation slot was full. Then her eyes settled on a small two-person table near the back of the restaurant. Normally they reserved it for overflow seating. At the moment it sat empty. "I think I can help." Daniel looked surprised. "You can?" Sophie smiled. "I know a table." A few minutes later Daniel sat comfortably near the back of the dining room. Not the best table. Not the worst. A simple table. Exactly what he wanted. Sophie placed a menu in front of him. "Can I bring you something to drink?" Daniel looked around the restaurant, watching guests, watching servers, watching the kitchen staff moving through the open service area. Then he smiled. "A coffee would be perfect." Sophie laughed. "Coffee for dinner? It has been a very long flight." "Fair enough." She disappeared toward the kitchen. Daniel found himself smiling again. Hospitality. Simple. Uncomplicated. The way it was supposed to be. Unfortunately, someone else had noticed the table, and she was far less pleased. Olivia Parker stood near the manager's station reviewing reservations for the evening. Everything needed to be perfect. For nearly 3 years she had worked toward a promotion. Long hours, weekend shifts, operational improvements, revenue growth, staff restructuring. She had done everything the company asked, and next week's leadership meeting could change her career. If all went well, she would soon oversee multiple locations throughout the region. The opportunity represented everything she had worked toward, which was precisely why she hated surprises. And right now she was looking at one. A walk-in customer occupying a table that wasn't supposed to be occupied. Olivia frowned. Who seated him? A nearby employee pointed toward Sophie. Olivia's expression tightened slightly. Then she looked toward Daniel. The worn travel bag. The simple jacket. No reservation. No visible reason to prioritize him. Meanwhile, several high-value reservations had not yet arrived. Olivia looked back at the seating chart. The table suddenly seemed much more valuable than the guest sitting at it. And without realizing it, she began making the same mistake that Jason Reed had made at Horizon Systemics. She stopped seeing a person and started seeing a problem. Several minutes later, Sophie returned carrying coffee. Daniel thanked her. The waitress smiled, then paused. First visit. Daniel looked around the restaurant, then smiled. Something like that. Sophie laughed. I'll take that as a yes. Daniel nodded. Let's do that. Neither noticed Olivia watching from across the room, and neither knew that before the evening ended, the question of who belonged in the restaurant would become the center of a very uncomfortable conversation. For the next hour, the restaurant operated exactly as Olivia Parker liked. Efficiently. Like clockwork. Tables turned over on schedule. Reservations arrived on time. The kitchen maintained pace despite the growing crowd. Staff moved quickly. Guests appeared happy. And every few minutes Olivia glanced toward the dining room with quiet satisfaction. This was what success looked like. Numbers. Organization. Control. Everything working exactly as planned. Meanwhile, Daniel Foster was having a wonderful evening. The coffee had become dinner. Dinner had become dessert. And somewhere in between, he found himself simply enjoying the atmosphere. Nobody recognized him. Nobody treated him differently. For the first time in years, he was experiencing the restaurant exactly as an ordinary guest would. And he found the experience surprisingly refreshing. Several times he observed Sophie helping customers. A nervous young couple on a first date. A family with 2 energetic children. An elderly man dining alone. Each received the same attention, the same patience, the same warmth. Daniel noticed. People like Sophie were one of the reasons restaurants succeeded. Not because they increased revenue, because they made guests want to return. Then everything changed. At 8:15 in the evening, Olivia received a phone call. The moment she saw the caller ID, her posture straightened. A major corporate client. One of the largest accounts in the region. The kind of customer that attracted attention from senior leadership. The kind of customer who could influence future opportunities. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. When it ended, Olivia immediately opened the reservation system. A problem. A serious one. The client was arriving in 20 minutes. With 2 guests. And there were no suitable tables available. None. Olivia began studying the dining room. Large tables were occupied. Private seating areas were occupied. Reserved sections were occupied. Every option seemed unavailable. Then her eyes settled on a familiar figure. Daniel Foster, sitting alone, near the back of the restaurant. Olivia stared for several moments. The solution seemed obvious. Too obvious. Across the room, Sophie saw the look on Olivia's face and immediately became concerned. She had worked with Olivia long enough to recognize that expression. It usually meant someone was about to be unhappy. Olivia approached Daniel's table. Her professional smile appeared immediately. "Good evening, sir." Daniel looked up. "Good evening. I hope everything has been satisfactory." "It has been excellent." The answer was genuine. Olivia hesitated, then continued. "I'm afraid we have an unusual situation." Daniel listened quietly. "A very important reservation has arrived unexpectedly." There it was. The phrase. Very important. Daniel found himself wondering what made one guest more important than another. But he said nothing. Olivia continued. "We were hoping you might be willing to help us." "How?" "We would like to move you to another location." Daniel glanced around. The restaurant appeared completely full. "What location?" For the first time, Olivia hesitated. Because there wasn't one. Not really. There was a waiting area. There was the bar. There was the possibility that someone might leave soon. But there wasn't actually another table. And both of them knew it. Daniel remained calm. "Would you like me to leave?" Olivia didn't answer immediately, because answering honestly would sound terrible. Eventually she nodded. "That would be helpful." At a nearby service station, Sophie froze. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. The guest had done nothing wrong. Nothing at all. He had simply accepted the table she had offered. Daniel looked at Olivia for several moments, then slowly nodded. "I understand." Olivia felt immediate relief. The situation was resolved. The important customers could be accommodated. The evening could continue. Everything was under control. Or so she believed. Daniel stood. The worn travel bag rested beside his chair. He picked it up. The old canvas looked even more worn beneath the restaurant lights. Exactly the sort of detail that reinforced Olivia's assumptions. Then Sophie approached. "Sir?" Daniel turned. "Yes?" The young waitress looked genuinely upset. "I'm sorry." The words surprised him. She wasn't responsible. Yet she looked as though she felt personally disappointed. Daniel smiled. "Why?" "Because you were our guest." The sentence was simple. Almost embarrassingly simple. And yet Daniel found himself smiling. Because it sounded exactly like something he might have said years ago. For a moment neither spoke. Then Daniel reached into his pocket and left payment for the meal, along with a generous tip, far larger than Sophie expected. "Thank you for your kindness," he said. Sophie shook her head. "You shouldn't have to thank me for doing my job." Daniel laughed softly. "That's where you're wrong." Then he picked up the worn travel bag, nodded politely to Olivia, and walked toward the exit. The restaurant doors opened. Cool evening air drifted inside. Moments later, he disappeared into the night. For several seconds, Sophie watched the entrance. Something about the evening felt wrong. Very wrong. She couldn't explain why. Only that it felt as though the restaurant had just failed an important test. One nobody realized they were taking. And less than a week later, everyone would discover exactly how important that test had been. The leadership meeting took place 5 days later. Unlike the restaurant dining room, the conference room felt quiet, controlled, professional. Large windows overlooked the city. Coffee cups rested beside neatly arranged notebooks. Regional managers filled the seats around the long table. Conversations flowed easily. Most people appeared relaxed. Olivia Parker did not. She appeared focused, excited, hopeful. For nearly 3 years she had worked toward this moment. The company was growing rapidly. New locations continued opening every year. Additional leadership positions were becoming available. And according to every rumor she had heard, today's meeting would include a major announcement. Her announcement. At least that was what she believed. As people settled into their seats, several executives entered the room. Olivia recognized most of them immediately. Operations leaders, financial officers, training directors, people she had met many times before. Then she noticed something unusual. An empty chair near the front of the room. Reserved. Important. Waiting for someone. The vice president of operations stepped forward. Thank you all for being here. The room quieted. We have several topics to discuss today. A presentation appeared on the screen. Performance metrics, expansion plans, training initiatives, the usual agenda. Olivia listened carefully, but her thoughts kept drifting toward the empty chair. Nearly 20 minutes passed. Then the vice president smiled. Before we continue, we are waiting for one more person. The room became attentive. Several managers exchanged curious looks. The vice president checked his watch, then nodded toward the conference room door. Perfect timing. The door opened, and Olivia's world stopped. The man entering the room carried a familiar travel bag. The same faded canvas, the same worn strap, the same patches from years of use. For one impossible second, Olivia thought she was imagining it. Then she saw his face. Daniel Foster. Every executive in the room immediately stood. Some smiled. Others walked forward to greet him. Handshakes were exchanged. Several people laughed warmly. Clearly, they knew him well. Very well. Olivia felt the blood drain from her face. The room seemed suddenly smaller. The memory returned instantly. The restaurant, the table, the conversation, the request to leave, the worn travel bag. Everything. Daniel greeted several executives before finally taking the seat beside the vice president. The empty chair. The important chair. The one everyone had been waiting for. Only then did he glance across the room. His eyes met Olivia's. For a brief moment. No anger. No hostility. No satisfaction. Just recognition. Then he smiled politely. Exactly as he had done in the restaurant. And somehow that made Olivia feel even worse. The vice president allowed the silence to linger. Then spoke. For anyone who has not met him personally. Several people smiled. This is Daniel Foster. A few managers nodded respectfully. Others sat a little straighter. The founder's reputation was well known throughout the company, even among employees who had never met him. Daniel stood. Good morning, everyone. The room greeted him warmly. He smiled. I've spent most of the last few years overseas. Several people nodded. Which means I've missed seeing many of you. His eyes moved across the room, then toward Olivia. Very briefly, almost imperceptibly. Yet she noticed. And so did several others. Daniel continued. Last Friday, I visited our original restaurant. The room immediately became interested. Managers exchanged glances. The story was clearly going somewhere. I arrived directly from the airport. A few people laughed. The travel bag probably gave that away. More laughter. Even Olivia managed a nervous smile. Daniel's expression softened. What I experienced reminded me why I started this company. The room became quiet, attentive. interested. And for the first time, Olivia began to suspect that the promotion she had been expecting might not be the most important thing discussed that day. For several moments, the conference room remained completely silent. No one interrupted. No one checked their phone. Every person in the room understood that Daniel Foster was about to tell a story, and that the story mattered. Daniel rested a hand on the worn travel bag beside him. The familiar canvas looked strangely out of place among polished conference tables and executive presentations. Yet somehow it belonged there more than anything else. I bought this bag when I opened my second restaurant. A few smiles appeared. Daniel looked down at it. It wasn't impressive then. Soft laughter moved through the room. And somehow it has become even less impressive since. More laughter. Even Olivia smiled despite herself. Daniel continued. I spent years carrying this bag through airports, construction sites, hotel rooms, and restaurant openings. His eyes moved around the room. And during those years, our company grew far beyond anything I imagined. The room listened carefully. We opened new locations. We entered new markets. We hired thousands of people. He smiled. And fortunately, most of those decisions turned out better than my choice of luggage. The room laughed again. The tension eased slightly. Then Daniel became thoughtful. But growth creates a danger. The room grew quiet. The larger a company becomes, the easier it is to forget why it exists. No one spoke, because everyone knew he was no longer talking about luggage. Daniel looked around the room. When I opened my first restaurant, we didn't have sophisticated systems. No regional management structure. No performance dashboards. No training departments. A few people smiled. We barely had enough chairs. The room laughed softly. But we did have one principle. His voice remained calm. Simple. Clear. If someone walks through our door, they are our guest. Silence. Complete silence. Daniel let the sentence settle. Then continued. Not our most valuable guest. Not our least valuable guest. Not a VIP guest. Not an ordinary guest. The room listened carefully. Simply our guest. Across the room, Olivia lowered her eyes. Because she knew exactly where the story was going. And she knew he was right. Daniel continued. Last Friday, I watched dozens of employees take care of guests. A few managers smiled proudly. As they should. Then he nodded. And one employee reminded me why this company exists. Several people exchanged curious looks. Daniel turned toward the back of the room. Would Sophie Martinez please join us? The conference room door opened, and Sophie stepped inside. The young waitress looked completely overwhelmed. Clearly she had no idea why she had been invited, or why so many executives were suddenly looking at her. Daniel smiled. Thank you for coming. Sophie nodded nervously. Of course. Daniel looked around the room. This is Sophie Martinez. Several people smiled. A few nodded politely. Last Friday, Sophie treated me exactly the same way she treats every guest. He paused. She found a table when the restaurant was busy. She checked on me throughout the evening. And when I was asked to leave, Daniel glanced briefly toward Olivia. She apologized. The room remained silent. Daniel looked toward Sophie. Do you remember what you said? Sophie's face turned red immediately. She clearly did. I think so. What did you say? The young waitress hesitated, then answered quietly, because you were our guest. Silence filled the room. Not uncomfortable silence. Meaningful silence. Daniel smiled. There it is. The room remained focused. Everything we teach. Everything we build. Everything we want this company to become. He nodded toward Sophie. That sentence. Several executives exchanged thoughtful glances. The lesson had become impossible to miss. Daniel turned toward Olivia. Not harshly. Not angrily. Simply honestly. Olivia. She looked up. Yes. I've reviewed your performance for the last several years. The room became attentive. Everyone knew how much this mattered. You have improved operations. You have increased profitability. You have helped multiple restaurants succeed. Olivia listened carefully. Every word was true. Daniel nodded. And because of that, I believe you have a future in leadership. Relief flashed briefly across her face. Then Daniel continued. But leadership is not only about running restaurants. The relief vanished. It's about understanding people. The room remained silent. And until Friday, I don't think you fully understood the difference. Olivia lowered her eyes. Not because she felt humiliated, because she knew he was right. After several moments, she nodded. I think you're correct. Daniel smiled. So did several executives. Growth begins with honesty. Daniel continued. Your promotion is not canceled. Olivia looked up immediately. The room seemed surprised as well. It's postponed. Silence. I want you to spend the next 6 months working with our training department. Several executives nodded approvingly. Daniel continued. I want you to help develop future managers. And I want you to spend time understanding the guest experience from every level of the company. For several moments, Olivia simply stared. Then she nodded. Not disappointed. Thoughtful. Perhaps even grateful. Because for the first time she understood what the opportunity really was. Finally, Daniel turned back toward Sophie. Sophie. The waitress looked terrified. The room laughed softly, not unkindly. Daniel smiled too. You are not being promoted to management. The relief on her face was immediate. The room laughed again. Good. Sophie almost sighed with relief. Daniel laughed. Because I wasn't planning to go into management. She continued. More laughter. Even Sophie smiled. Starting next month, I would like you to work with our training department. Sophie blinked. The room became attentive. I want every new employee, every supervisor, every future manager to understand what hospitality actually looks like. Sophie stared, completely speechless. Daniel smiled. We can teach procedures. We can teach scheduling. We can teach operations. Then he nodded toward her. What you understand is much harder to teach. The room erupted into applause. Warm, genuine, deserved. As the applause continued, Daniel glanced once more at the worn travel bag beside his chair. The old bag had crossed oceans, survived years of travel, and somehow carried him exactly where he needed to be. Back to the place where everything started. Back to the lesson that mattered most. Later, as the meeting ended, Sophie walked beside Daniel toward the exit. The young waitress still seemed overwhelmed. Can I ask you something? Daniel smiled. Of course. Why did you open your first restaurant? Daniel looked toward the city outside the windows, then smiled. A quiet smile. The kind that comes from remembering something important. Because everybody deserves to feel welcome somewhere. Sophie nodded slowly. The answer felt simple, yet somehow exactly right. Daniel turned toward the door and walked away, not thinking about expansion, or profits, or growth, but about guests. The reason everything had started, and the reason it would continue.